Part 3. The 1844 General Conference may be described as the conference in which the Great Schism occurred. As you know, we talked about that last week. That was where the vote to ask Bishop James Andrews to release his slaves. He said, the slaves don't belong to me. They belong to my wife. And then we had this separation of the North Church and the South Church. This period of 1844 to 1863 may be called the lull after the storm. Both the northern and southern delegates returned home bewildered, defeated, misunderstood, and met with great disapproval. Because the ones at the South felt that, here we go, listen to this argument, the ones in the Southern church felt that the General Conference did not have jurisdiction in annual conference matters. That's an interesting argument, isn't it? Or the federal government does not override the sovereignty of the state. So that, you see where that argument comes from. It started in the Methodist Church. And then those in the North who were pro-slavery, they had to go back and defend their position because it was in the North where the great slave traders existed. So this whole issue of affecting the commerce was not only a Southern issue, but it was a Northern issue as well. So the both delegates had to go home and explain what had gone on. So you can see they were bewildered, defeated, misunderstood, and neither one of them were met with great approval. The Southern church was confident that the slavery question had been settled at the 1840 General Conference. The Northern delegates were met with questions regarding the constitutionality of the action. Somehow that word constitutionality comes up quite a bit in the 1800s and in the 21st century. Y'all notice that? The constitutionality. The Great Schism. Working out good. The division in the Methodist Episcopal Church planted a seed which perhaps eventuated in the division of the nation. And I'm one of those who would be a part of that if the Methodist Church had resolved the issue, had met some unity on that issue, being anti-slavery, possibly civil war would have been averted. But you can see there was great discussion and division both in the North and the South about this because there was a great commerce on this, and we'll get to this later. And many of the people involved in this whole slave trade were Methodist people. Both churches, North and South, had to start anew. The Northern Conference is united in a concerted effort to make Methodism a strong bulwark against slavery. However, it was not a majority of them. They were not unanimous in this, but there was a majority. The Church North began to increase its ministry to Negroes in their territory. The Church South confined its missionary work primarily to the slave population. By 1849, 15 annual conferences of the Church South had established African missions. Keep that in mind, 1849. The Methodist Episcopal Church South had established African missions. There were 122 missionaries at work amongst the slave population. A conservative estimate is that Church South spent possibly $1,320,778 from 1985 to 18. Did I say 19 again? As Freudian slip. From 1845 to 1860 on these plantation missions. Just meditate on that for a while. This is what they're spending on missions on plantations in the South. Now, let's look at this question came up last week and I didn't have an answer for it. We were talking about AME Zion, but I was able to get some information on this question at this point. The location of black people in Methodism. Keep in mind, we're just dealing strictly with the Methodist Episcopal Church, North and South, not the AME or AME Zion. In 1843, there were 147,409 black members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. This number constituted about 12% of the total church membership. Only 13,464 blacks lived in the boundaries of the 15 northern conferences. More than 2/3 were found in Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. In 1843, there were 39,495 black Methodists in South Carolina alone. They weren't AME, they weren't AME Zion. They were in South Carolina. Many churches in Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri were opposed to being related to the Southern Methodism. there were churches equally opposed to being connected with the Methodist Episcopal Church. So you had this schism along the border states, you know. And to keep in mind, this is pre-Civil War. So they are making decisions on which church that they're going to be a part of. Isn't that an interesting question? Which church are they going to be a part of? Are they going to stay in the Methodist Episcopal Church, or are they going to be in the Methodist Episcopal Church South? Some of y'all didn't get the humor in that statement. Okay, I see y'all not, my jokes are not catching you today. All right. 1844 General Conference. One of the actions of the 1844 General Conference was a revocation of the plan of separation by the 1844, that's my mistake. One of the actions of the 1848 General Conference was the revocation of the plan of separation by the 1844 General Conference. That should be 1844 and not 1848. It was based on a petition received from the border states. So 1844 was the separation, but they come back to General Conference 1848, and they want to revoke the action that was taken in 1844. This petition recommended the annulment of the plan of separation. There was no justifiable reason for the plan of separation, the petition argued. The Methodist Church had violated the agreement by establishing churches in the North, and annual conferences did not ratify the plan. So these were the three reasons why they wanted to revoke or nullify what was decided in 1844. There was no justifiable reason for the plan. The Methodist Church South had violated the plan by establishing churches in the North, and then annual conferences did not ratify the plan. So these are the three reasons why they wanted to revoke the plan. However, the revocation of the plan of separation made possible the return of Methodist Church to southern regions of the nation. Many bishops and laity did not concur with this action. The plan was not revoked, but they all had to settle, amicably agree to disagree. The 1856 General Conference allowed several petitions to be placed on the calendar to change the general rules of slavery, which were part of the discipline. This conference did not succeed in changing the general rules, because in the general rules, this was a statement that was left in the discipline. We declare that as much as ever convinced of the great evil of slavery. We declare as much as ever convinced of the great evil of slavery. This was still left in the discipline, but they let us say there was nothing, as I heard in 2019 at the Special General Conference, in our era, you had to have some enforcement in there. Things can be in the discipline, but if there's no enforcement of it. That sounds familiar, doesn't it, Michael? You know, why is it in the discipline? Black Methodists came back to this conference to press the claim for independent churches and black preachers. The General Conference voted non-concurrence. That statement was left in the discipline, but the black Methodists who were part of the church, they had not left for the AME Church or AME Zion Church. They wanted now to have independent churches for blacks and preachers, but the General Conference voted non-concurrence. However, it approved of black people having separate quarterly conferences when it was in the judgment of the presiding elder to be expedient. You can't separate and have your own independent churches, but we will allow you to have your separate. Because keep in mind, all of the black missions of black churches were still under the jurisdiction of the province of either the church north or the church south. There was still a connection going on. The 1860 General Conference. On March 6, 1857, the United States Supreme Court ruled Dred Scott was denied his freedom on the ground that he was a slave in Missouri, and a slave was not entitled to sue. By its ruling, Negroes were considered as inanimate objects, without rights to be respected and guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence. This is the Dred Scott decision. And many would argue this decision, along with what had happened in the 1844 General Conference, were the preambles to the Civil War. Because Dred Scott could not sue. He was not considered a person that the Declaration of Independence covered. because Negroes, blacks, or Africans at that time were inanimate objects. After much debate, the General Conference amended the discipline, making slavery inconsistent with the will of God, as well as admonishing all preachers and church people to keep themselves pure from this great evil and to seek its extirpation by all lawful and Christian means. However, the Supreme Court has already ruled that the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution does not apply to you. But it's asking that we are against this great evil and let us use all lawful and Christian means. This action caused many preachers and members to withdraw from the Methodist Episcopal Church and unite with the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Let's chew on that for a while. Just chew on that. Because of this position, because the South Church basically was in agreement with the Dred Scott decision, but there were those in the North who felt that that was not the will of God. The General Conference of 1864. In 1864, the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on May 2nd, 1864. High on the agenda was the planning for the evangelization of blacks in the South. As victory appeared imminent for the Union Army, this conference began to perfect this plan to invade the South with teachers and missionaries. And there were three things, there were these questions that were foremost in the minds of the delegates. What shall we do for Negroes, and how shall we best minister to them? People were beginning to see that the Civil War may be coming to an end, and now it's an opportunity for us to resume our activities, our mission work in the southern regions. Still acknowledging that there's a Methodist Episcopal Church South, but at the same time, we can carry on our missionary efforts in the South. And the questions that they were concerned with: what shall we do for Negroes, and how we best can minister to them? You can kind of see the schism that's going on, the kind of schizophrenia, the split, because you still have the Methodist Episcopal Church North, and you have the Methodist Episcopal Church South, but the North is coming into the South now with a different understanding of the discipline, and the South is going into the North with a Southern understanding of the discipline. This is an interesting moment in the life and history of the church. All these different perspectives. Three views were presented. Three views were presented at the General Conference of 1864. Negroes should be encouraged to unite. We go back to this. Negroes should be encouraged to unite with the independent Negro branches of Methodism. Boy, that was another Freudian slip. Ecclesiastical equality was advocated. This was a minority viewpoint. And establishment of mission conferences for Negroes in the North. These were the three views that kind of defined the General Conference. We can encourage Negroes to unite with independent branches of Methodism, AME Zion Church. We can bring about ecclesiastical equality, which is a minority view, or we can establish mission conferences for Negroes in the church wherever they are, whether in the South or in the North. These separate conferences were essential because through them the greatest good could be accomplished. For the same reason, there existed German conferences and Scandinavian conferences and French and Welsh missions. On March 30th, 1864, the New England Conference admitted John M. Mars, an ex-slave, into the conference as a full member. In March 30th, 1864. An ex-slave was admitted into the conference. We talk about being admitted into the conference. We're not talking about as a delegate. We're talking about as a conference member, a minister, a local pastor. At that time, you would be an elder. That was a two-step ordination or a deacon. So this is full membership. Then each church, a conference has their delegates. So this is the first person that is admitted into the conference with full rights and appertaining to of an elder in 1864 in New England. The organization of black conferences had its greatest period between 1864 and 1868. The Delaware Conference was the first Negro Mission Conference. It was founded on July 29, 1864. The Washington Conference was the second Negro Mission Conference on October 27, 1864. Then we followed with the third conference was the Mississippi Conference on December 25th, Christmas Day, 1865. The original members of the Mississippi Mission Conference were all white ministers. They were on a land lease from Northern Conference. So still, you would have Negro conferences and Negro branches of Methodism, but they were being led by white or Caucasian ministers. In 1866, the South Carolina and Tennessee Mission Conferences were established. In 1867, the Texas and Georgia Mission Conferences were established. Then the North Carolina Mission Conferences were established on January 14, 1868. General Conference 1868. This General Conference, listen to this word, faced a constitutional crisis. Yeah, you hear that quite a bit now, constitutional crisis. The Negro Mission Conferences could not send delegates to General Conference. They could not, no, this way it gets real. They could not draw dividends from the book concern. And they could not vote upon constitutional amendments. They were part of the church, but they couldn't send delegates. They couldn't draw dividends from the book concern, and they could not vote on constitutional amendments. Even though the Negro conferences had elected delegates, they could not be seated without some modification of legislation adopted in 1864. One thing I noticed about when they would have these general conferences, they would last like a month or so. I hadn't figured out how they could afford to do all of that. On May the 11th, 1868, after a 10-day debate, the 1868 General Conference voted to rescind portions of its 1864 decision. The approved legislation gave the mission conferences the status of annual conference. And see, that's still quite a distinction today. Is it a mission church, is it a faith community, or is it a charter church? Similar same thing with annual conference. So initially, these were started as mission conferences, but now they are changed to annual conferences. James Davis of Delaware Conference and Benjamin Brown of Washington Conference were the first blacks to be seated in the lawmaking body of the Methodist Episcopal Church known as General Conference. These were the first blacks to be seated as delegates. James Davis of the Delaware Conference and Benjamin Brown of the Washington Conference were the first blacks to be seated in the lawmaking body of the Methodist Episcopal Church General Conference. Continuing with black conferences organized. From 1868 to 1927, there were 11 annual conferences for Negroes organized. All except one was organized in the Deep South. The South Florida Conference was the last one to be organized. The Central Alabama Conference was organized on October the 18th, 1876 at Cornhouse Campground in Randolph County near Wedowee, Alabama. When I was a child, we used to say Wedowee, but it's Wedowee. How many of y'all know what Wedowee is? Okay, y'all pretty good, all right, yeah. Eventually, it covered all of Negro Methodist Episcopal Church North congregations in the state of Alabama, as well as the panhandle of Florida. It included several districts that were formerly belonging to the Alabama Conference. Here's a question. What constituted the Alabama Conference? You had the Central Alabama Conference and the Alabama Conference. What constituted the Alabama Conference? Y'all seem like y'all afraid to say that. Go ahead. I can't hear you. Thank you. Good. So what was once districts that were in the Methodist Episcopal Church South became part of the Methodist Episcopal Church North's annual conference for Negroes in the Central Alabama Conference. All right, good. elements here, and then we're gonna stop a little early today, because I know a lot of this got to give you a chance to digest it. The Board of Home Mission and Church Extension. Make sure that's good. Yeah, all right. So I'm dealing with two different clickers up here. I want to make sure I'm synced. From 1865 to 1884, the Board of Church Extension assisted 1,117 Negro congregations in the erection of their first churches, 1865, 1884. By 1884, it dispersed, listen to this, by 1884, it dispersed a grand total of $181,952.95 in donations and $101,539 in loans to 15 Negro annual conferences. And yes, these are 1865, 1884 numbers. In 1884, black conferences contributed a grand total of $22,109.84 to the church extension fund. It always amazed me that they can give you right down to the penny. It wasn't no rounding, they wasn't rounding no numbers off. They gave you right down to the penny. Although this was a small amount, you need to understand this, although this was a small amount compared to what they received, it represented sacrifices when measured against the income of these poverty-stricken, recently emancipated people. Because keep in mind, this is going on during the period where it was known as what? Reconstruction. Oh yeah, I got you over there. For the quadrennium, 1880 to 1883, the mission department dispersed $241,950 in missionary apportionments to these black conferences. Chew on those numbers. That's the Board of Home Mission and Church Extension. The Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, better known as CME. With the end of slavery, the Methodist Episcopal Church South realized missionaries from the North would ultimately take many of its members. Isn't that something? There is this competitiveness among who's going to get. I had to watch myself here. Forgot I'm in a mixed audience and I'm in church. I can't really say what I want to say. I want to see Jesus when I come in. At the end of slavery, the Methodist Episcopal Church South realized missionaries for the North would ultimately take many of its members. More than half the Africans involved in the Methodist Episcopal Church South left during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. The Christian or colored Methodist Episcopal Church developed not out of protest over racial discrimination within the church setting and was not solely the product of Africans establishing their own religious institutions as a form of protest. There was cooperation between the Methodist Episcopal Church South and its African members. During 1866, the transfer of ecclesiastical power from the Methodist Episcopal Church South to members of the black community commenced as the annual conference began to ordain black preachers. The ME Church South, that's what MECS means, in 1866 began to do a slow, gradual transfer of ecclesiastical authority by annual conference beginning to ordain black preachers. By the end of 1866, the annual conference of the White Methodist Episcopal Church South had ordained 26 black local pastors and 2 presiding elders. Religious independence and economic empowerment were priorities for the church, for the future of the CME Church. They wanted control over their own religious affairs, and they felt that they were the legitimate heirs of property from the plantation mission. That's what this whole thing now is about going on in the current Methodist Church in, what year is this, 2022. It's the 3 Ps, Alex. People want to keep their property, they want to keep their money, and they want to choose who their preacher is. It's about 3 Ps. So similarly, this is the same discussion that the colored Methodists that were part of the ME Church South were saying to the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Since we've been a part of you, we've been on your plantation, and you've given us some property. We want to separate, but we want to take the property with us. Now, that's where the fight is always over, who gets the property. You know what I'm saying? These Southern black Methodists felt it was more advantageous to be an ally. Stay with this one now. These Southern black Methodists felt it was more advantageous for them to be an ally of former slave owners than to form an alliance with the AME Church. Because the AME Church was looked upon as being what? A dangerous organization. And still fresh in their minds was the insurrection supposedly by Denmark Vesey and the construction of the Citadel, the original campus, where they pointed the cannons, at the church. I was given an article today that was in the Wall Street Journal about Denmark Vesey, and talk about that. A lot of people say, well, they didn't know that. Well, I didn't know it either. I knew something was going on. So that was the issue. They didn't want to be AME, but they were encouraged. Keep in mind, we said earlier, they were encouraged to go and join another church. Don't stay in AME, don't stay in the Methodist Episcopal Church North and South, but y'all can go on now, go on. Y'all want to leave, you just go on now, go on. Getting quiet. At a meeting held in 1870 at Liberty Church in Jackson, Tennessee, Southern Methodists worked out the plans for the creation and the establishment of the colored Methodist Episcopal Church. The name was later changed to the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church in 1956. Because keep in mind, they didn't want African in the name because they saw themselves as being, that we're in the South and we identify with color and we want to be still aligned, with our former colleagues, but we don't want to be identified with that Richard Allen crowd. I mean, this is what they were saying. You don't want to be, I almost said something there. Y'all knew what I was about to say too, don't you? Thank you. There's another error. Both the AME and AME Zion missionaries remarked that the CME Church was the church of those who favored slavery, and joining it would not be an exercise of freedom and liberty. That's my mistake. Both the AME and AME Zion missionaries remarked that the CME Church was the church of those who favored slavery, and joining it would not be an exercise of freedom and liberty. Keep that in mind. This is 1870. We're going to come up with something in a few minutes, a similar statement. The CME Church began operating without the hardships faced by the AME and AME Zion churches. It already had 40,000 members when they started. In 1873, there were 67,000 members in 14 annual conference. And less than 50 years later, they had over 700,000 members. This was CME Church in the South. The CME Church's first successful effort resulted in the establishment of Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee in 1882. Also in Jackson, what other college was in Jackson, Tennessee? Lambert, and there was another one. There were 3 schools in Jackson. Now there are only 2. Lambert is closed. I forget the name of the other one. In 1882, Lambert was founded by the ME South Church, but it no longer exists. Also in 1882, through a cooperative educational venture between the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, Payne College in Augusta, Georgia, was established in memory of Bishop Robert Payne of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. This was a cooperative venture. See, the first church was started by the CMEs totally. The second church was started by the CMEs and the Methodist Episcopal Church South in Augusta, Georgia, which still exists today, known as Payne College. All right. The Freedmen's Aid Society. The Freedmen's Aid Society was organized in 1866. On May 7, 1866, a group of ministers and lay people were called to Cincinnati, Ohio, to consider the relief and education of the freedmen or former slaves. The society was approved by the General Conference in 1868. In 1872, it was approved as an official agency of the church, and the first secretary was Richard S. Russ. Remember that name, Richard S. Russ. In one of its first reports, the society, the Freedmen's Aid Society, stated, their labors would be fruitless unless schools be established, intelligence disseminated, and the teachings of the pulpit supplemented by the instruction of the school. We're talking about freed Negroes, slaves. Their labors would be fruitless unless schools be established, intelligence disseminated, and the teachings of the pulpit supplemented by instruction of the school. The Freedmen's Aid Society. The need was everywhere, but the society had to decide upon the most strategic locations. They should be located at the center of population. The density of Negro population was important. They should be located in places where freedmen would cooperate, and they should be located in places where schools were tolerated. That last one is going to become real interesting when I talk to you about what happened in the state of Alabama. Now, alongside the Freedmen's Aid Society was the Woman's Home Missionary Society. The Woman's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church was organized in Cincinnati on June 8, 1880. Stay with me on this one. The first president was Mrs. Rutherford Hayes, the wife of the President of the United States of America. What do you all remember about Rutherford Hayes? Let me ask you, did you say nothing? Okay. How many of y'all ever heard of the Compromise of 1876? Compromise of 1876 had to do with the presidential election, right? And no one was declared the winner, right? So supposedly there was an agreement reached that they would allow Rutherford Hayes to become the president based on what condition? The election was held up. There was a contestation, if there's such a word, of the count of the votes that were cast. And so they reached an agreement that we will allow Rutherford Hayes to be the president, but you would have to pull all the federal troops out of the South, which became the end of Reconstruction. So Rutherford Hayes becomes I think the guy he ran against was Tilden. Is that his name? Yeah. Now, is that critical race theory to talk about this stuff like that? Y'all getting quiet on me on this one now. But that was a compromise. That was the agreement. We will allow Rutherford Hayes to be the president, but you got to pull all the federal troops out of the South, which basically ended Reconstruction. And now, 4 years later, his wife becomes president of the first women's organization of the Methodist Episcopal Church. How many of y'all were aware of this? Y'all getting mighty quiet on me. Is it time to go? Need a break or something? The General Conference, we'll be through in a few minutes. The General Conference of 1880 approved of the work among Negro women and girls by the women of the church. Women of the church. Keep that in mind, because that's going to come back again, women of the church. These two organizations, the Freedmen's Aid Society and the Woman's Home Missionary Society, became co-partners in Christian training for the freedmen in the South, as well as freed women. They worked hard to thaw the social iceberg in the Deep South. The Freedmen's Aid Society and the Women's Home Missionary Society. The establishment of Negro institutions of higher learning. The Methodist Episcopal Church organized 25 institutions of higher learning for blacks in the Negro Conference. The plan was to start at least one school in each Negro Conference. Today, 2022, there are 10 of these schools still surviving. Paying colleges included as a result of the Plan of Union of the three branches of Methodism adopted in 1938. That's what we're going to talk about next week, the Plan of Union. 2 schools in addition to the 10 are professional schools, Gammon Theological Seminary and Meharry Medical School. How many of y'all knew that Meharry Medical School was United Methodist? The oldest of these schools started by the Freedmen's Aid Society is Rush College, which began at Shaw University in 1866. The name was changed to Rush College in 1899 in honor of Richard S. Rush, the first secretary of the Freedmen's Aid Society. These black institutions have served as custodians of an African heritage where an appreciation of black culture has been developed. Now I want to go back to that first statement. No, the second statement. The plan was to start at least one school in each of the Negro conferences. How many of y'all have ever heard of the Central Alabama Institute? The Central Alabama Institute was a school for African Americans in Alabama. It was established as the Russ Normal School, a school to train African American teachers in Alabama, in 1872. It opened in Huntsville, Alabama in 1878. It became known as the Central Alabama Academy in 1890. In 1904, it moved to Mason City. Mason City is on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama. See, Birmingham had all these black communities: Mason City, Zion City, my wife from Zion City, Pratt City, Hooper City, Gate City. All the black folk had their own little community. They just separate them out, you know. And they eventually came in the city limits, but for years they didn't run, you know, water lines and water lines and sewage lines out there. They were just out there. In 1904, it moved to Mason City on the outskirts of Birmingham. In 1922, its main buildings and other structures were struck by fire. It was not rebuilt or reopened. The school was affiliated with the Methodist Church. My argument is, wherever you have had one of these schools, you will find a vibrancy and a richness in Methodism. In Mississippi, we had Russ, and New Orleans, Louisiana, there was Dillard. Atlanta, we have Clark and Payne, Claflin, Hudson, Tillerson, several, Bethune-Cookman, and several other ones around the area. But wherever you find a Wiley College, yes, wherever you find a college that was started right after, during Reconstruction, after the Civil War, where it was started for Negroes by the Freedmen's Aid Society and Women's Board of Mission, you will find a great vibrancy within the church. Similarly, most of our annual conferences to this day have a school that was founded. Some conferences, like the former Alabama conference, which became the Birmingham area, up until 1975, had 3 schools that it supported: Birmingham Southern, Huntington College, and another school that many people were unaware of called Athens College. Black conference growth and expansion. Blacks participated in every phase of growth in Methodism in the 19th century. However, it was only a matter of time before they needed and desired their own annual conferences. The reason for this fell into 2 categories: credibility and advancement potential. Negroes belonging to these churches were taunted by members of the AME Church and AME Zion churches for belonging to the white man's church. You know, we still get some of that today, you know. Never get a guy who sell the Final Call newspaper in front of the church, his name. And he was telling me he wanted to come over there one day and talk to me. This was some years ago, about Louis Farrakhan coming to the church. And I said, well, you know, I had talked to my trustees about that, you know, they didn't want to know how many people. I said, well, we can't discuss that. He said, you United Methodist, aren't you? I said, yeah. He said, you in the white man's church. I said, no, I'm not in the white man's church. What church? I'm in a church that has white members. It's not the white man's church. But that phrase has constantly been there. Keep in mind, this is what the CMEs were taunted with, and this is what the AMEs and AME Zions were using against Negroes. They say, you belong to the white man's church. Because we were not allowed to ordain elders, we couldn't have presiding elders, we couldn't have bishops, annual conference of delegates, and many churches lost members or defections to these other Methodist bodies. Second, only annual conference could provide the necessary status, security, and opportunity for ordination, conference membership, and eligibility for appointments as presiding elders, bishops, and general conference representation. So these were the 2 rationales that kept pressing the need for a full annual conference participation and recognition. All right, I think we got a couple more we had then. By 1900, there were 18 Negro conferences in the ME Church, had about 1,706 ministers in full connection, 3,398 churches with an aggregate church membership of 239,274. Of this total membership, got the right one? Of this total membership, 174,950 members were living in the South. There were 2,301 organized congregations in the South that year. In 1900, farming was the chief occupation of Negroes. 53.7% of all Negro workers were engaged in farming at the turn of the century. Also, 92% of the Negro population lived in the South. This is before the Great Migration. Approximately 136,635 Negroes lived in states where cotton was the principal product. Many of the Negro Methodist churches were located on plantations or in open country. Prior to 1900, conferences in the South were inclusive. And we're going to let you know why they were inclusive. They were supervised by white bishops. Y'all didn't catch that, did you? They were inclusive. That question came up in one of the earlier studies. They were inclusive. They were black conferences, but they were supervised by white bishops. And the bishops, in some areas, had interracial cabinets. By 1900, all conferences were Negro conferences. No longer did the bishops have white presiding elders in his cabinet. The term presiding elder was used until 1908, when it was replaced by the term district superintendent. By 1870, there were 18 black presiding elders in the Methodist Episcopal Church, with 5 black conferences organized to that date. By 1939, there were 84 black superintendents or presiding elders in 1872. Negro leaders presented a resolution to the General Conference requesting an elder of African descent be elected to the episcopacy. Yeah, this one, I don't know, this is the second time this is done. This should have been earlier. 1872, General Conference did not approve the resolution. However, the General Conference did adopt a resolution stating, there is nothing in race, color, or form or condition that is a bar to the election to the episcopacy. Right, so that was the issue before this one about electing a black to the episcopacy. They say there's nothing in race, color, or form or condition that is a bar to an election to the episcopacy. For us to, this is about why they petitioned them to elect a black as a bishop. But they didn't approve the resolution, but they passed this resolution, that there is nothing in race, color, or form or condition that is a bar to an election up to the episcopacy. For us to elect such persons, listen to this, these are the qualifications. They had to be elected by their piety, endowments, culture, general fitness. Being of African descent does not prevent membership with white men in annual conference, nor ordination, nor appointment or ability to the highest office. But in order to go to the highest office, you had to have piety, endowments, culture, and general fitness. Being of African descent did not disqualify you. But you had to have piety, you had to have endowments, culture, and general fitness. The petition was, we elected out. Nobody's catching this, is it? I call this that to be elected to the episcopacy, you have to have intangibles. And what are intangibles? Nobody knows what they are. That's why they're intangible. With this adopted resolution, color was stricken from the discipline, making all members eligible for leadership roles based on qualifications and acceptability. In 1896, the black delegates discovered a qualified black elder for the highest office. See, they told them that you got to have one that's qualified, and they got to be credible, acceptable. So as normally as black people, we go out and find that person that you say fits your program, your profile. I almost said something. Y'all knew it too. That is. Yeah, I'm glad y'all here. Y'all my balance here. The Reverend Dr. John Wesley Edward Bourne Sr. of the Washington Conference was the choice of the black delegates to be elected bishop. He was the first Negro to earn a PhD from Boston University in systematic theology in 1886. Y'all want somebody qualified and acceptable? Here's your man. Also at the time, he was professor of historical theology at Gammon Theological Seminary in Atlanta, Georgia. He was not elected. He was not elected. You told us to go get somebody qualified, somebody pious, somebody, that was acceptable. He was not elected. The day had not arrived to elect a black man to the episcopate. After this, Negro leaders changed perspective. They no longer petitioned for a black to be elected to serve the black conference. Now the urgency began to elect a black man as a general superintendent, bishop over the entire Methodist church, not just over black folk. The Venerable Reverend Dr. John Wesley Edward Bourne Sr. was the first black to hold the presidency of Gammon Theological Seminary from 1906 to 1910. Because prior to that, presidents of Gammon were white. But he was the first black. That's the end of the show for today.